So how can I find out whether I'm actually a human or not? So what would you say actually sets us apart right now? Or maybe I'm a hybrid too and just don't know it.
Yeah,
That could be the case too.
that's possible, yes. Very few hybrids actually know that they are hybrids. At that point, you'd have to start making some kind of questionnaire. Since hybrids have a few, let's say, super skills, a few more abilities like the ability of telepathy, for example. But since it's not explained how to be telepathic or what telepathic information actually is, and most people think they're hearing voices in their head or they're hearing thoughts, but telepathy is much more than that. Telepathy is the energetic reading of information fields. And then on top of that, there are also different types of hybrids. So it's not just, let's say, human plus some kind of hybrid, but rather human with reptilian. For example, they're called Kingo, or human with Pleiadian, with Theta, with other human species. And depending on what is hybridized, what is connected with the human, with the earth human, there is also a different consciousness touch behind it. For example, the reptilian human hybrids are very, very dark. And you can always tell that they, let's say, have a very painful aura around them because invasive behavior is constantly triggering you. These people are also hybrids, but simply for the more negative faction. That means they are portals for all kinds of lower astral beings, specifically reptiloids. There are also countless of them here on this planet. Then there are also Pleiadian hybrids, Theta hybrids, Yael hybrids. Especially the children who are crystal children are Yael hybrids here on this planet. You can recognize them, for example, by their slightly larger eyes and their extremely high empathy. You could also say that a touch of autism is present in the high-frequency hybrids. You just have to look here and understand that there are many species, countless species, as many as there are stars in the sky, who bring their consciousness here. And in my case, it is human plus a version of future humans, who sometimes also call themselves Zeta and Pleiade. And if you know, for example, what the Pleiadians look like, you can see that in my face as well. For example, the small ears, which are much smaller than normal, the eyes that flatten out at the sides here, the narrow eyebrows, this whole facial contour, also the way my limbs are and how they are structured, you can notice the hybridization. But the problem is, here on Earth, so little real information is shared about ETs that it's hard for a person to even recognize, based on physical features, that someone is a hybrid. Generally speaking, hybrids who are connected to high-frequency star civilizations are often very delicate in build, for example, with very, very long, thin fingers and an exceptionally good metabolism. That means I have a very, very good figure, not at all flabby, soft, or anything like that. But that doesn't mean it always has to be that way, because other factors also come into play. How much of the star genetics has been hybridized into a being? So it's really hard for the individual who wants to know right now, am I a hybrid or not, to recognize it. It depends on which species was hybridized in. And then it can also happen, and I keep explaining this, that a person born as a human, for example, begins to raise their consciousness and starts to hybridize themselves. That means at the moment when a person begins to remember that they live on other planets. And not just because someone told them so, or because it sounds nice, but truly manifest memories. In other words, you begin to be, as the incarnation on another planet begins, that being starts to become present in this person, and the hybridization begins. So at that moment, you could even determine in a person that star genetics are active there. And in the same way, for example, a person who remembers other lives, for instance, suddenly he remembers that he has had many lives in Japan, even though he is European. For example, you could determine that from the moment this memory arises, and not just a vague, oh, I once lived in Japan, but actual memory fragments come through. That suddenly in the genetics, in the DNA test, Japanese origins appear, they become visible. And that can happen in a genetic test that was submitted 5 years ago, for example, if you use Ancestry or any of those other DNA tests. Then all of a sudden it would appear that Japan has suddenly been activated in the DNA profile, or India or whatever. Humans still look similar, but in genetics, to a small extent, this begins to activate, even in genetics, because there is no space and time. Ultimately, for energy, genetics begins to show something new, which is reflected directly, even if the genetics were given 10 years ago. That's also called quantum entanglement. And such phenomena are happening more and more now, especially these days in our civilization, that suddenly genetic codes are changing, both on a human level and that suddenly genetics is added to the mix, which one has from the stars. The only problem is it doesn't appear on Ancestry because this genetics is simply not in the database. But there are, let's say, factions on this earth called the deep state or the cabal, the elite. I actually don't agree with that. To me, it doesn't feel right to call them elite because that would put them above others. From my perspective, they are not that. Maybe they have a greater awareness, but they oppress people, which is why I don't put them above myself or call them elite. So I prefer to call them the cabal or deep state because their actions actually place them beneath humanity. Anyone who abuses others is definitely not above those they abuse, but in many ways beneath them. But that's just a quick random thought. In any case, these factions have the ability to recognize certain things. They can tell which hybrid is which and whether a person is a starseed or not, based on their frequency. They might not be able to tell how much of a person's DNA is active, but with measuring devices, which interestingly are built into wonderful Apple devices in the cameras, they can read the aura field and identify where are the star seeds, where are the hybrids, because the aura is different.